Um, our, our first reading this morning is a poem by Jeffrey Monroe. I know nothing about him except that I found this poem in some reading recently, and I loved it. Murmuration. Does everyone know what a murmuration is? Starlings. You can find all sorts of fantastic YouTube videos if you want. I don't have any murmuration videos, but this is Jeffrey Monroe's poem called Murmuration. On a sullen December afternoon, I turn a corner into a Hitchcock movie. 500 starlings staring at me. Not a murder of crows, but I fear for a moment a homicide of starlings. Yet they part before me like I'm Moses, or at least Charlton Heston. I've come in peace. They let me pass. I move ahead after a pause, then look back and see them coalesce again into one black mass pulsing, having the same mind that unfurls like a flag or waves like a wave, whipping and wilting, skittish sky dancers who treat the earth like a trampoline. I'm not sure of the physics or metaphysics, but in that moment, I see clearly they survive because they have each other. Oh, I love that. Thank you, Jeffrey Monroe. In the weekly email this week, I pointed out that today in the church year calendar commemorates the baptism of Jesus, which, as I said, we might think of as the moment when he started living into the mission to make God's love and God's justice rhyme. I am not going to read that story this morning or even really talk about Jesus in the sermon, but we can still hold on to that idea of being commissioned and having a sense of what you're supposed to do as a frame of sorts for today's reflections. The assigned Bible reading that I've chosen to read today out of the group of 4, we get 4 to choose from every week, it does have some water imagery in it, and it's got a couple of verses that bring great comfort to people who internalize them as kids. When I was an adolescent, there were 2 verses out of this passage formed a song that still bangs around in my head and surfaces periodically. But just past those verses is a section that's so shocking it feels like a slap in the face, if all you know is the comforting part. For now, I'm just going to read the passage as it is, and then maybe I'll talk about that part later. This is Isaiah 43, verses 1 through 7. Now this is what God says. The one who created you, O Jacob, who formed you, O Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you, and through the rivers, they shall not overwhelm you. When you walk through fire, you shall not be burned, and the flame shall not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I give Egypt as your ransom, Ethiopia and Seba in exchange for you. Because you are precious in my sight and honored, and I love you, I give people in return for you, nations in exchange for your life. What? Do not fear, for I am with you. I will say to the north, give them up, and to the south, do not withhold. Bring my sons from far away and my daughters from the end of the earth, everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made. So there at the end, the Spirit's universal impulse even overrides maybe the prophet's narrow frame of vision. That's the reading. Wisdom laid an egg in November. That might sound like political commentary, but it's not. Not exactly. We'll go back further. In 1956, Chandler Robbins was a 38-year-old ornithologist. He was already in a career that would make him a giant in the field of conservation. One of his crowning achievements actually was to perfect a method for a citizen bird count. He would recruit enthusiastic volunteers to each claim an area, count the birds that they saw during a particular period of time, record that, submit their data. But in 1956, he was far from here. He was on the Midway Atoll, which is an island in the North Pacific about 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii. And he was there studying a species called Laysan albatrosses. He was observing them. He was putting bands on them to track their movements and population. One of the albatrosses that he banded in 1956 was at least 5 years at the time. They, of course, couldn't tell when she was hatched, but when he found her and put the band on her, she was nesting on an egg. And albatrosses don't lay eggs until they're 5 years old. So she was at least 5. Somewhere along the lines in their observations and tracking this albatross population, scientists gave this particular one the name Wisdom. Chandler Robbins died in 2017. Wisdom, the Laysan albatross that he banded in 1956, outlived him. Albatrosses mate for life. They lay at most 1 egg per year. I don't know if scientists had a name for Wisdom's first mate, but he died sometime prior to 2006. 2006 is when she took up with a new mate that scientists called Akea Makai. I had to look up that joke. New love can bloom at 50. Just do the math. 1956 to 2006. Oh, 55, actually. Okay. But I had to look up the joke, Akea Makai, the mate's name, is a Hawaiian term that means philosopher, lover of wisdom. Very clever, those scientists. The last time that anyone saw Akea Makai was in 2021. Wisdom did not lay any eggs since then. But last spring, they saw her return again to the island. They also saw her flirting with potential mates, trying to find a new one. And on November 27 of this past year, she laid an egg, making her, at the age of at least 74, not only the oldest known bird, but the oldest known bird to lay an egg. Scientists think that it might be as much as her 60th. Will it hatch? That's anyone's guess. Albatross eggs incubate for about 65 days. So by my math, there's about 3 weeks left before we'll know that. But until then, I'm thinking about that egg as a symbol of hope, which maybe I'm putting too much weight on a fragile egg. I don't know. I mean, it's just a bird, right? In the grand scheme of things, does it really matter that much? I don't know. I see some yeses. So good. Thank you for going with me. Last year was the hottest year on record. California is burning again. Wars continue to rage. Next Monday's coronation will mark the return of an administration whose energy policy seems to be summed up with the phrase, drill, baby, drill, that explicitly seeks to undo, let's wrap our minds around this, that wants to undo environmental regulations that the fossil fuel industries support. Oh, and that is making noise about starting economic and actual wars with our allies. Like, what is even happening right now? What's the good in tucking a little hope into an elderly albatross's nest? Maybe this is a good moment to say a little bit more about that Bible reading. I kind of feel like squirrel. I didn't have a good transition there, so we'll just run with it. Sorry, I also might have triggered Priscilla when I said squirrel, so I hope you're okay. All right. Sorry. The book that we call Isaiah was written in at least 2 distinctive historical periods, separated by 300 years, 200 years, maybe. Has at least 2 different authors who make it up. The bit that we read from today was composed, it's from the middle of the book. It's composed during a period called the Babylonian captivity, or the Babylonian exile. In 597 BCE, the Babylonian Empire, or the Neo-Babylon, Babylon 2.0, invaded, or they laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. A decade later, they went further than that siege. They did a full-scale invasion. They carried off parts of the population, especially the leadership structure and people we might think of today as influencers. And they resettled them in another part of the empire. About 50 years after that, which is when this Isaiah was writing, the Persian Empire ascended and did defeat the Babylonian Empire. And the Persian Empire was friendlier to the Hebrew people, sent them back into their territory to resettle and to rebuild their temple. But that part had not yet happened in this part of Isaiah. The political prognosticators that we call prophets saw it coming, but it was still only conjecture on the horizon. So this reading was directed at people who lived in exile, but for who the most part probably didn't remember the act of exile itself or the place they were taken from. They heard the stories. They were the grandchildren, maybe even the great-grandchildren of the people who had been physically carried off. They represented 2 and 3 generations of exile. The exile and the hoped-for return to the homeland is why we get, I think, that troubling, we'll call it a psychological projection, the whole bit about God trading in the lives of other people in exchange for the lives of the Hebrew people, which doesn't make any logical sense. Like who is God even trading with at this point? But it does make a certain emotional sense as the language of a group of people who had been morally, physically, economically, and nationally injured. It was a bit of poetry and prophecy, in other words, that was directed to people who were accustomed to living under insult. They were used to things being bad, and they really didn't know them any other way. Can we relate? Probably not most of us here, at least not in any direct way, I would guess. I don't mean that as a blanket statement, but I do mean that on the whole, we are a group with a great deal of privilege. But even so, the historical context of this passage can pose an interesting question to us, which is, how much do we accommodate ourselves to bad situations? And how much do they numb us into forgetfulness about what could be and what should be? In the case of ancient Israel, several decades into the Babylonian captivity, we might imagine that there was a continuum of responses, just as we see a range of responses today to what we're walking into. Some folks figured that a couple of generations in Babylon made it their home now, for better and for worse. They'd made the best they could out of a tough situation and didn't want any more upheaval. Thank you very much. That was that. Some were maybe even doing relatively decently, and so didn't want a disruption. Some were still nurturing the seed of anger, but didn't figure anything would come of it. Some acquiesced to a sense of fatalism. But then came this prophet talking about God still knows your truest name, and it is still beloved. Talking, in fact, about redemption and protection and about return. And talking maybe a little weirdly in the present tense, like this had already happened somehow. I have redeemed you and called you by name, giving promises about protection from harm, even though harm had already come and already been done. I will be with you when you cross through the waters, and when you pass through the fires, they're not going to burn you up. Hidden inside those reassurances is the heartbreaking knowledge that some had already drowned and some had already been consumed. Not everybody was going to make it back. Grief would be packed in the luggage alongside the linens and the summer clothes. But still, hope beckoned in this. The vision of something better to cling to in honor of those who would not make it, and in pledge to those yet to come. Can we hear a parable for ourselves as we move further into January? Hand-wringing and despair will not be a sufficient response, in other words, especially for those of us with our various forms of privilege. We have to hold on to and listen for and craft and live into and work with a vision of hope. And that vision has to include and maybe even come from those who are targeted and vulnerable. If you'll indulge yet another recourse to Nick Cave, one of these days I'm just going to have to send him some money for writing all my sermons. He wrote something this week that I really appreciated. He started by lifting a quote from his own book, which was, "Hope is optimism with a broken heart." And then he elaborated. This means that hope has an earned understanding of the sorrowful or corrupted nature of things, yet it rises to the world even still. We understand that our demoralization becomes the most serious impediment to bettering the world. In its active form, hope is a supreme gesture of love, a radical and audacious duty, whereas despair is a stagnant rejection of life itself. Hope becomes the energy of change. We know that things are going to be bad in the coming year. We know that there are some things that are very bad already. Some things will turn out better than we fear. Some will probably look much like we expect, and some will go a lot worse. We can expect all of this as a given. But there is also this. About 1,200 miles northwest of Honolulu, Wisdom, the Laysan albatross, is living on the Midway Atoll National Wildlife Refuge. She was born there just a few years after that site saw one of the most important and violent battles of World War II. She was born there maybe 15 years before Chandler Robbins' research helped the Navy adjust the runways for their planes so they'd stop running into albatrosses. And she has thus far survived increasing plastic pollution and rising sea levels that threaten the albatross nesting grounds. She's about 30 years older than the next oldest known Laysan albatross. Life is resilient, in other words. I tell myself this at my most cynical and pessimistic moments, in spite of the evidence to the contrary. I claim it like a promise in honor of those who won't make it and a pledge for those yet to come. Life is resilient. Life is persistent. Life finds a way. Wisdom laid an egg in November, and this is God's good news. Amen.